Alrighty, y'all. You know the drill. This isn't going to be a fun video, so no intro, because today we're going to be talking about the allegations against famed author Neil Gaiman and the role BDSM may have played in what he allegedly did. Before we get started, I think it's worth telling you all what my potential biases are so you can factor that into how you evaluate what I'm saying here. If for some reason you're just coming across my channel and you haven't seen my content before, I am a full-time kink educator here on YouTube, and I've been in the BDSM community for almost 10 years. So, while I am very informed, this also makes me a little defensive of my community as well. Though I will try my best not to let that color what my opinions are, at the same time, this does also give me a unique advantage compared to many other people covering this story. I know what consensual kink is supposed to look like because I've been doing it for almost a decade, and I am intimately familiar with the ways people try to use BDSM as a shield for toxic and abusive behavior. I hope I can use this background to provide a unique and accurate perspective you aren't likely to hear from many other sources. And on a completely different note from that as well, I am not someone who is coming into this as a fan of either Neil Gaiman or Amanda Palmer. I was sort of vaguely aware of both of them, but never closely followed what they were doing. The only thing involving Neil Gaiman that I have knowingly consumed is the book Good Omens, which I read because I'm a fan of Pratchett, not Gaiman. And I am so not in the loop on Neil Gaiman that I actually had to Google how to pronounce his name. And to be honest, I am still not sure I'm going to say it right all the time, so please forgive me. And it's not like I actively disliked him or Amanda Palmer, I just wasn't fans of theirs. So I'm not coming into this as either an aggrieved fan or someone trying to root for their downfall. I just want to know what allegedly happened and what we can learn from all of that. So, what did actually happen? What stories are these allegations sharing? So, like many other people, I first became aware of allegations against Gaiman in the summer of 2024, when a group of women came forward to accuse him of sexual misconduct. And I will warn you all right now, the allegations against Gaiman, if you haven't heard them yet, are both numerous and specific. Some of this is going to be hard to hear, but I want to cover what happened as accurately as possible. So, this all started when two women spoke to the British news outlet Tortoise in July of that year. The first article, titled Exclusive, Neil Gaiman Accused of Sexual Assault, followed a 4-part podcast series released by the same outlet, which went into more extensive detail about the nature of the allegations. The article, however, summarized the accounts as, quote, involving rough and degrading sex with the author, which they say was not always consensual. The first woman, Scarlett, was in her early 20s at the time the alleged assault took place in 2022, very soon after meeting Gaiman for the first time at his home in New Zealand. She was working as his nanny. The second woman, who goes by Kay in the article, made allegations that misconduct against her started several decades prior. She met him as a fan at a book signing in 2003, when she was just 18 years old and he was in his 40s. They then went on to have a romantic relationship after she turned 20. Both Kay and Scarlett described their experiences as involving rough and painful acts of penetration. Gaiman denied these allegations, stating that he believed any of the acts they did to be lawful and consensual, going so far as to claim that, quote, Scarlett was suffering from a condition associated with false memories at the time of her relationship with him, a claim which is not supported by her medical records and medical history. And even at this point, where we are barely scratching the surface, I am seeing some worrying trends. An 18-year-old who was a fan? A woman who worked for you in her early 20s in your home? Denying the allegations by, in part, making a false memories claim, which is dubious in and of itself, not to mention the fact that these allegations are separated by nearly 2 decades, which indicates this could be a pervasive, lifelong pattern and not a one-off incident or some kind of confusion. But as I said, We have barely scratched the surface, and unfortunately, more allegations came out soon after these, which support the idea that this is, in fact, possibly a pattern. A few weeks after the first article dropped in early July, a follow-up article was published by Tortoise once again, including more allegations from two new women. The first, Caroline, lived on Gaiman's property in New York between 2014 and 2021, where she worked both as an independent artist and as a sort of groundskeeper/house assistant alongside her husband for Gaiman and his then wife Amanda Palmer. When Caroline and her husband split in 2017, she and her daughters became dependent on Gaiman for both housing and financial security. Gaiman would allegedly use this dependence to manipulate Caroline into performing sexual acts on him, including in the presence of one of his own kids. When she attempted to deny his advances, he would subtly, or not so subtly, remind her of her precarious situation living on his property. Gaiman then left the property during the start of COVID, which did not stop his advances. He instead switched to sending sexual videos and photos of himself and requesting the same from her. When she stopped responding, he made good on his previous covert threats to evict her and had her removed from the property. She later signed an NDA to prevent her from speaking about these issues in the open and was compensated $275,000 for her hardship. It is important to note that NDAs are typically void when they attempt to limit reporting of criminal acts. The second woman, Julia, made allegations that stretched back to 1986. He was 25 at the time and recently married to Mary McGrath, who was the mother of his first child. Julia alleged that he somehow got into her London apartment and pushed her down onto the sofa while forcing her into a deep kiss. Though things did not progress beyond that point, the situation continued to haunt her, and upon hearing the allegations made earlier that month, she worried if not doing something about it had enabled his future behavior. Gaiman again denied the allegations made by both women, stating that the incident with Julia was simply an awkward misreading of the situation. Never mind the fact that he was married with a young child himself at the time, and the incidents with Caroline were consensual because, well, she started it, so therefore she wanted everything that happened to happen to her. And then, just when it seemed things might be going quiet, a fifth allegation came out at the end of August that year. Claire, another fan who met Gaiman on a book tour in 2014, alleged that he, quote, took her to a room with a bed at the back of a bus, closed the door, then got on top of her and started kissing her and groping her under her dress and over her breasts. An allegation that sounds scarily reminiscent of some of the ones made against rock stars like Marilyn Manson. As though this makes the situation better, Gaiman countered that the two had been in correspondence prior to the bus meeting, and that he thought based on that she wanted sexual contact. As in previous incidents, though, he claimed that he stopped when he knew that she didn't want his affections and otherwise behaved in a totally consensual manner. Though at a different time, he paid her $60,000 to cover the cost of her therapy sessions over the years as a result of his behavior, and admitted that what he did to her was, quote, effed up. Are we starting to see some patterns here? Are they starting to fall into place? Because what it's looking like to me so far is that Gaiman, allegedly, across the decades, pursued women who were vulnerable to him, either because they were employed by him, dependent on him, or in a parasocial relationship with him due to being fans of his work, with many facing the additional vulnerabilities that come with large gaps in age and socioeconomic status. People like Chris D'Elia and Marilyn Manson come to mind as folks who similarly use their fandoms as hunting grounds for, at best, potential sex partners. Even on YouTube and Twitch, niche micro-celebrities have often used their fan bases for the purpose of getting sexual content. People forget this amongst the rest of his public marriage debacle, but Pro Jared infamously ran a Sin Tumblr blog which included the sharing of nudes with fans. James Charles used Snapchat and Instagram to attempt to start relationships with people who were his fans that were explicitly sexual in nature. And More recently, as I was writing the script, in fact, the streamer Destiny has been outed for not only having multiple sexual relationships with his fans, but allegedly also producing and or sharing content without the consent of all of those involved. I even know of extremely teeny tiny little small-time creators who have a fraction of the audience of any of these people who have done similar things. It seems that no matter how big or small the audience is, when some people get a little taste of power, seemingly the first thing they ask themselves is, how can I use this to get access to sex? Which is, I think, wrong and gross. And almost universally, people who do this seem to misunderstand consent and sexual coercion, or at least they imply that they do to be able to cover themselves. They nearly always say that they thought what they were doing is fine because the fan reached out to them first, or because it was only over text, or because they weren't a minor, or because they would have stopped if the person directly said no to their face, but they never did. That's something I noticed in particular about the allegations with Gaiman. Across all of the allegations we have talked about so far, there's this pattern that he thinks what he did was fine because he says he thought he got consent, or because he did eventually stop at some point. But the allegations aren't about normal people in equal relationships, they're about power. When someone adores your work, when someone is dependent on you for employment or for a roof over their head, you have a power dynamic with them that can be exploited. Per the Fry's model of consent, which stands for freely given, revocable, informed, enthusiastic, and specific, a person in such a position cannot provide adequate consent because it cannot meet the first standard, freely given. There is an inherent pressure to a non-consensual power dynamic that can unduly influence someone's decision to say yes, or their inability to say no. It is this very pressure that abusers and exploiters use, unknowingly or otherwise, to get what they want from people. And I am sure some fans of Gaiman will excuse this because of his age and the fact that many of these situations took place before we really understood what consent was all about or whatever. That doesn't negate the fact that this, so far, does appear to be a pervasive trend in his life until basically the current day. Even if he hadn't thought about it as a consent issue, if he really cared about doing better, why weren't those early experiences 20, 30 plus years ago not a wake-up call that he needed to act in a different way and be more explicit in seeking an uncompromised yes before anything, and that he should maybe, I don't know, stop pursuing fans and people who were dependent on him? Despite whatever excuses someone might make, it is actually really super easy to not sext your fans or ask them to send you nudes. I know, hard to believe, but it really actually is that easy. But Neil, it seemed, just really liked to cultivate a connection between himself and his audience, especially online. I don't see people talking about this, but in the early 2010s, he was quite active on Tumblr and spent lots of time interacting with folks on there. He endorsed a fan-run Tumblr blog which shared photos of all ages and in all manners of dress and undress, reading his books in a bathtub. As far as I'm aware, this blog had no age verification and could have well-hosted photos of underage people, nude or semi-nude, in a bathtub. Neil engaged with these posts directly and even reblogged them as well. The fact these photos involved a bathtub will become disturbingly poignant later on. And because that blog was ran anonymously, I've seen some people question about whether or not he was running the blog himself and just pretending not to. It's also worth pointing out as well that this engagement happened around the time the tour bus incident is alleged to have occurred with Claire, where he said he talked to her before taking her to the bed in the back. In fact, in the details revealed in the podcast version of the article about this allegation, we learn that Claire volunteered to hold books for him at a book signing, which escalated into a relationship where he continued to invite her to events, and despite the fact she was repeatedly clear about not wanting to have sex with him, he continued to press her, reminding her with language like, "Kiss me like you'll never see me again," that if she did not comply, their attachment would be severed. Gaiman appears to not only have experience at finding and exploiting fans, he seems to be practiced at it and knows what to say to get what he wants. Gently opening the door to physical contact, then escalating to thigh touches, kisses, and then eventually sexting and genital contact, saying things like, "I don't know what I see in you. I'm an award-winning, best-selling author," reinforcing how he is special and valuable and they're nothing by comparison. It's gross and it's calculating. The fact he never seemingly stopped to think, hey, maybe I shouldn't try to have sex with 22-year-old fans or get sexual favors from them just because I can. That's inexcusable. The other allegations are replete with moments of manipulation like the ones that Claire experienced. Kay, another fan who said the relationship with Gaiman became inappropriate, the same Kay we talked about earlier, emailed him via his website after meeting him in person. He pursued her for 2 years after first meeting her at 18, requesting a birthday threesome with her and her friend when she was around 19, though she did turn him down. At 20, though, they began a relationship which Kay describes as consensual at first, though he often tried to guilt her with lines like, "Whenever I come see you, you don't have sex with me enough." Do I really need to say that that is not a healthy way of asking to get your legitimate needs met? And Scarlett, the first woman to make allegations against Neil in public, further describes in her interview that, quote, "He'd say things to me that made me feel reliant on him." In the text messages Scarlett shared with reporters, she's verbose, pouring out her thoughts. In return, he gives her shorter, terse, non-committal messages. This lack of reciprocity could be read as her being the real pursuer in the relationship, but it could also be viewed as another manipulation tactic. Him using brief answers when he is a literal, world-famous author may be a way to get her to try and invest more, to try harder to please him, and to try and keep his attention. Any adult that has been in a relationship with someone who swears they totally are into you and definitely like you, but strings you along with just enough attention that it keeps your hopes up, knows the feeling that's going on here. You're just so afraid of losing this connection that you actually try harder to keep it, even if you weren't really that into that person in the first place. It's manipulation. And it could very well be intentional too. If his text messages don't let anything on from his end, he can paint a different story about how he felt at the time later, right? And someone reading them might go, oh, well, he's not really that into her, and so therefore he wouldn't have never done anything to actually assault her, right? We'll talk more about what is in these text messages soon, though, because they are important, but for now, I want to bring us back to the current day. These are the allegations as they existed in the summer of 2024. They gained some traction, but they didn't explode quite the way they did more recently. The reason I'm talking about all of this today is because about 2 weeks ago, New York Magazine's Vulture publication brought all these stories back into the spotlight, with even more disturbing details and some new allegations. And that Vulture article opens with a story, again, about Scarlett, detailing the beginnings of her relationship with Neil vis-a-vis her relationship with Amanda Palmer, who she met randomly on the street in New Zealand. Palmer leveraged their friendship, using the desperate Scarlett to get free labor and favors in exchange for emotional connection. Scarlett described her loneliness at the time, quote, "I'm hungry, I'm so effing famished." Soon after beginning to take on an au pair-like role for Palmer's household, she was introduced to Neil. On the first night they met, he gave her several glasses of alcohol while he stayed sober. This is not the first time that Neil would have used booze to his advantage in these allegations. Claire, for example, was drunk during at least one of her interactions with him, where he escalated the amount of physical contact they'd had up to that point. Scarlett then alleges that he asked her to take a bath outside, where they had a large clawfoot tub on the property, originally framing it as a way for her to be able to ward off her boredom while he attended to other things. Once she was naked in the tub, though, he arrived naked as well and invited himself in and attempted to penetrate her multiple different ways. The use of a tub in this encounter is additionally concerning when you learn elsewhere in the article that Neil had been drowned in a tub by his own parents as a small child. So it seems that Neil had a reason to include tubs among his sexual fixations, because that is one way that a lot of people deal with traumatic experiences. And again, I point to the fan-run Tumblr blog involving people taking photos in bathtubs. He then told her, "Call me master and I'll come." He said, "Be a good girl. You're a good little girl." This is the first time something I'd call BDSM related has come up in the allegations, at least as I've read them to you so far. It won't be the last. Another woman, a sixth named Brenda, recounted to interviewers how in the 90s she'd met him at a fan book signing, like so many of the others. Their relationship became sexual, and she said, "He seemed to have a script. He wanted me to call him master immediately. He demanded that she promise him her soul." Caroline, the artist who helped take care of his New York property, similarly recalled, quote, "He used to say to me, 'Call me your master. Tell me you want it. Tell me you want it.' He would choke me sometimes." While we might generally find it, let's say, cringe that a man in his 60s would demand to be called master from the first moment of a sexual encounter, it is more than that. It lends credibility to the allegations as a whole. After all, how likely is it that so many women, separated by decades and literal continents, would have the same idea about how he might act out of nowhere, especially when he's been pretty buttoned up about his sex life? And furthermore, if a man is willing to continually get into sexual interactions with fans and vulnerable people in the first place, and then on top of that, start asking for very particular sexual favors without clear negotiation beforehand, what does that say about how they practice consent? Calling someone master in the bedroom is all well and good. The problem is asking for it without a clear outside of sex talk first, and demanding the title spontaneously from people who would be pressured to say yes, even if they wanted to say no. Many of his interactions are described as including phrases like, "Tell me you want it," or "Kiss me like you mean it," which I guess maybe could be read as wanting to have an assurance of consent in a totally different framework, "Hey, I want to make sure you're also into this." Or it could be a reflection of the fact that he knows these acts aren't authentically desired by the women performing them, but he wants them to act like they want it anyway. At least, that's how I read it. His supposed BDSM proclivities, though, went far beyond wanting to be called master. As Kay experienced, quote, "Gaiman didn't believe in foreplay or lubrication, which could make sex particularly painful. When she said it hurt too much, he'd tell her the problem was she wasn't submissive enough. He talked at length about the dominant and submissive relationship he wanted out of me," she tells me. She had no prior interest in BDSM. She says Gaiman never asked what she liked in bed, and there was no discussion of safe words or aftercare or limits. He'd ask her to call him master and beat her with his belt. These were not sexy little taps, she says. When she told him she didn't like it, she says he replied, "It's the only way I can get off." Later, while on a trip together, she developed a painful infection that was so bad she couldn't sit down, even after setting boundaries around penetration for that night, stating she would die if he tried anything. He did anyway. She told him no, and he continued to have sex with her until he finished. This is, unambiguously, rape. I am not going to put any pretty YouTube censorship words around it. That is rape. This is one of the reasons why people often don't say no. Because if you feel like you can't, if you feel like they're just going to keep doing it anyway, or make it worse, or punish you for it later for saying no, sometimes it's easier to say nothing because you don't want the answer to that question. It makes the reality of that scenario less scary in a way. But if the allegations are true as described here, at a bare minimum, Neil Gaiman raped someone under the guise of BDSM. He defended himself by stating that, quote, "BDSM may not be to everyone's taste, but between consenting adults, BDSM is lawful." Yeah, between consenting adults. I don't know how to tell you this, but if someone says no and then you do it anyways, that doesn't count as having consent. Even if you've talked about wanting to be someone's master, and even if you've said they're going to be your submissive or whatever the heck. Fun fact, Kink relationships are not one size fits all. It's not inherently the case that even if you enter into a negotiated dom-sub relationship, that means your partner has complete sexual access to you 24/7, no limits at all. All of that has to be talked about and agreed to directly and specifically. Listen, okay? Again, I've been in the BDSM world for 10 years. In that time, I have had several DS relationships, including ones that incorporate elements of sexual consensual non-consent and free access to my body. But even in those relationships, if I was in pain from an infection, my partners would not guilt me into sex because I'm your dom. This is the only way I can get off. We have a saying in kink. If you want to keep your toys, don't break them. Not listening to their no is a damn sure way to break them. Having a DS relationship or stating a desire for one does not give you carte blanche to do whatever you feel like any time of the day, and running over a person's no, making them do things that are harmful to their body and to their spirit, will have consequences. Even in the most extreme, physically intense master-slave relationships, there is still that basis of freely given consent and respect for your partner, which, as we have already established, it wasn't possible for these women, most of them at least, to have freely given consent for the interactions with Neil because of the power differential between them, even if he had asked for explicit consent. Scarlett, for example, had been homeless, suffered from mental health issues, came from an abusive household, and desperately needed a place to stay amid the pandemic lockdown lest she have to sleep in a freaking sleeping bag on the beach. Could she have consented to Gaiman's advances under those conditions? I don't think so, and neither does she. Like the tortoise one before it, the Vulture article shares snippets of text exchanges between Gaiman and his accusers. Scarlett, like several of the other women, texted him positive thoughts after and between their encounters, telling him things like, quote, "I am consumed by thoughts of you," and "I'm effing desperate for my master." And here, we need to pause and think about the nuances of how traumatic experiences and relationships can impact people. Many of the women we know, at least temporarily, played along with Neil's master fantasies to preserve their insecure attachment or to avoid losing their homes and/or employment. This does not mean they led Neil on. Remember how they got here. Thinly veiled threats, promises of a rare, valuable connection. Coercion is coercion no matter how you slice it. As Planned Parenthood describes, quote, "If you've ever gone along with sexual activity but didn't really want to, you may have been sexually coerced." Sexual coercion is using pressure or influence to get someone to agree to sex. People can knowingly coerce others into sex, such as learning manipulative pickup artist strategies, or unknowingly, such as assuming the other person is okay when they're not. This can include behavior like repeatedly requesting sex, suddenly initiating sexual activity out of nowhere, guilt-tripping or shaming someone, such as by reminding them that they're a nobody or telling them they aren't submissive enough, reminding them of some obligation you have to each other, like stating you need to have more sex because look at how much effort they put into trying to see you, and pushing substances, especially staying sober while plying the other person with drugs or alcohol. Up negotiation is a common tactic too, like, say, offering to draw someone a bath, then inviting yourself into the tub, and then starting sex acts while in the tub with them out of nowhere. If we look at Neil's behavior through the lens of sexual coercion, the nature of the allegations becomes crystal clear. This is a situation of skillful, practiced sexual coercion, conscious or not, intentional or not. Gaiman described himself in a documentary as having, quote, "the kind of monstrous self-certainty that you only get normally in people who then go on to conquer half the civilized world." And perhaps he didn't become a colonizer, but is it so hard to believe that this charming, confident attitude wasn't used to influence the outcome to sexual scenarios he was in? People often expect that people who are predators know it in some way, that they feel like predators. But they don't always. They frequently justify their behavior with weird, porous lines like, "well, it was consensual because it was BDSM and she wanted to be my sub, so obviously I had permission to do whatever I wanted, right?" It is possible to be a consent violator without admitting to yourself first, that you are violating people's consent, even if it's a routine behavior spanning decades. Not looking at the behavior too closely is what helps people preserve it, because if you don't analyze it and you just immediately justify whatever you're doing, you never really have to change or admit you're harming people. But more to the point, I want to discuss women's behavior in these text messages. If you haven't dealt with an abusive relationship or sexual coercion before, they might seem confusing. People expect that if you've just been violated, you'll want to get away from the person as soon as possible and immediately cut all contact. But especially when you feel trapped in a situation, be that physically, financially, or emotionally, it's typical to have a trauma response where you fawn and try to maintain a good relationship with the person who violated you until you feel ready and safe enough to be able to leave. It can also be challenging to accept that what happened was a violation in the first place. Our brains are typically pretty protective of us, sometimes to the detriment of being able to see what the truth is. It can take us a long time to process trauma, sometimes months or even years. In the interim, it can feel like the only option is not to rock the boat and keep doing what you did before, coasting essentially, while our brain is dealing with all the trauma and pain on the back burner. And sometimes that can go further into telling ourselves that we do actually feel okay. We ignore what our body is telling us. We don't want to think about what happened, even as we're obviously very conflicted about it. One side of our brain will say, hey, that super wasn't okay and that was really messed up. And the other side will argue with that, going, hey, but we like this person and they say that they're good and they say that they want us and they're a feminist and they say sexual abuse is wrong and they support women. So how could they treat me this way? I must be mistaken. I clearly must not know what happened to my own body. And sometimes it's easier to go with that second side to try to desperately believe that the person is who they say they are and not who they act like. That is why it can take years to come to terms with what happened. So basically, what I am trying to say is that trauma is complicated and weird, and sending texts about how you are desperate for someone is not an indication that a consent violation didn't take place. In fact, some of the specific phrasing used, like being desperate and being consumed by thoughts of someone, might very well be symptoms of trauma. If your brain is spinning its wheels on, oh my God, what the hell just happened, you'll probably be obsessively thinking about that person and what they did, which might be misinterpreted as enjoyment. If you're desperate for someone, that could be a side effect of emotional manipulation. It's not as clear cut as, she included a smiley emoji, case closed, she was totally into it, and now she's lying. And yeah, there's one more thing we need to talk about here, one more big subject, and that's pain. Neil is right that adults can consent to pain in a relationship. But is that what he did? Did he give people consensual, negotiated experiences of pain? It wouldn't appear that that's what happened, at least according to these allegations. One new allegation revealed in the Vulture article is from Rachel, who was introduced to Gaiman through Amanda Palmer after they'd already started a sexual relationship between themselves. She says there was never a blatant rupture of consent, but that he was always pressing her to do things that hurt and scared her. Caroline has also described randomly being choked by Gaiman, and that he twisted her nipples. Kay recounted how he would make her have sex without the use of lube or foreplay, despite how painful it made the experience for her, to the point it eventually led him to allegedly rape her. Claire recalled that on one occasion when he started phone sex with her, he began to explain how he would fuck me until it almost hurt because of how big he was, despite her again continually stating that she did not want to have sex with him. And then there's what allegedly happened to Scarlett. While I think sharing these allegations are important, and that people ought to listen to them to understand the gravity of the situation, even for me, these specifics are difficult to recount, and I didn't even have to live through them. Scarlett alleges that he initiated anal sex with her without lube, eventually resorting to using butter after she screamed no, because I guess no, obviously, was just in reference to the lack of lube, right? Jesus Christ. He then, and I'm just going to quote directly from this so there's no ambiguity, quote, he called her slave and ordered her to clean him up. She protested that it wasn't hygienic. He said, "Are you defying your master?" she recalls. "I had to lick my own shit." There were other, further instances after this where he penetrated her so roughly that she passed out from the pain, another where he made her consume her own vomit after throwing up during oral sex, but it wasn't even just physical pain, as disgusting as those things are to experience non-consensually. It was psychological too, performing sex acts on her and fondling her in open view of his child, despite the fact this could be mentally scarring for both of them. Gaiman has always been scarce with the details about his early life, but coming from a Scientologist household where he was drowned at least once in a bathtub, one can make some unfortunate inferences about why he may not have, to put it lightly, a robust sense of boundaries around his own children. As the trite saying goes, hurt people hurt people, but that is not an excuse. There is not a single instance of pain or control in any of these allegations that seems to match the definition of a consensual, negotiated BDSM scenario. Even in the cases where the women did not directly say no, they sure as hell were not providing an informed, freely given yes, for the reasons we have already talked about. And also, both in kink and in vanilla sex, consent to one act is not consent to the same act in the future or further acts. You can be okay with kissing or bathing together, but not want to be penetrated. You can say yes to anal, but not to unprotected anal. And most importantly, you should have a way of ending the experience at any time. None of the women mentioned the use of a safe word or any kind of boundary setting whatsoever. If Neil wants to call what he did to those women consensual BDSM, he ought to be able to show that he has talked about those things to them, right? Otherwise, he, expected them to give him blanket consent for whatever he wanted just because they had a conversation with him and they'd known each other for like 2 hours? That's not how it works, and I am disgusted by the idea anyone could think to call what is outlined in these allegations BDSM. He may very well have desires that could be considered kinky. Kink fantasies are really common, but that's not how he acted on them. He seems to be attempting to use public ignorance of how BDSM works to try and cover up and explain away his behavior. And I am sure this works on some people. Even in the media coverage of these allegations, the reporters covering the stories have gotten some of the intricacies wrong. At other times, they've said some pretty incorrect and even disparaging things about BDSM on the whole in their coverage that have nothing to do with what Neil did. While I originally planned to cover all of that in this video, this is a 10-page long script, okay? I did not have the time or energy to cover that as well in this. It would have been 15 pages. So prepare for a part 2 where we do cover those bits of media coverage in more detail because I wanted to focus instead, at least today, on the nature of what the allegations say. For now, I do want to end on one little last final bit, and that would be Amanda Palmer. And I have seen her referred to as Gaiman's Ghislaine Maxwell, and that's not without good reason. At one point while all this is happening, Scarlett confides in Amanda about what she experienced with Neil. Amanda informs her that this has happened before. 14 other times, to be precise. Not all of them were like what Scarlett went through, though, but several still said they were disturbed by what he did to them. One wonders then, did Palmer keep introducing women to Gaiman for a particular reason? Why did she invite vulnerable women onto their private island abode in New Zealand? Why did she, the avowed feminist who spoke frequently about the sexual abuse of women in her work, stay by a man she knew had a slew of women say they had disturbing experiences with? At one point, she and Gaiman were having sex with women together, though none of the stories here involve the two of them pursuing the same woman at the same time. She seemed to play a sort of fixer role for him, trying to smooth things over, playing the confidant on the one hand, while still sending women into the fire that is Gaiman's sexuality. At one point, early in their interactions, Gaiman remarked that Palmer had said he couldn't have her. in regards to Scarlett. While that might have originally been taken as a statement of jealousy or boundary setting on Palmer's behalf, it reads in a much more sinister light once you know that at that point she already knew at the time that he had done this over a dozen times. This is not to place the blame on Palmer's feet. Gaiman is still the primary abuser here. But Palmer was something of a secondary abuser, feeding women knowingly into that wood chipper and gently cooing at them to keep them there, saying platitudes, pretending to be some kind of compassionate shoulder after the worst had already happened. How these dynamics evolve is complicated, and we don't know Palmer's side of the story because she's essentially refused to comment on it in any particular direction. But at the very least, she enabled the worst of his tendencies, the pursuit of younger, vulnerable women who would have been reluctant or unable to say no. And that is disgusting. As I've already talked about, I am going to be doing a part 2 where I cover more of the media coverage and how BDSM was talked about as this was being put into stories online, because there were a few parts where I really raised my eyebrows and went, why are we painting with such a broad brush here? But suffice to say that the allegations against Neil, which they've not been in a court of law to this point, several of the women did file police reports against him, but none of them resulted in any kind of prosecution, at least up till now. And again, we don't know if any of this is 100% true or not, but considering the number of them, the similar details, how far apart in time and space all these very similar allegations are, it's not looking great. And it is continually disappointing to me how there are people who will use their desire for BDSM as a cudgel, as a tool to attempt to get something out of someone that they don't really want to be giving. Like, it's, again, BDSM fantasies are very common. It's not impossible to find appropriately aged consenting partners who have the same fantasies as you. But Gaiman didn't want that. What he wanted was, he seemingly wanted women who were manipulable, that didn't have experience, who were fans of his, that he essentially wouldn't have to work very hard to manipulate into doing what he wanted them to do. And it's just gross. And especially the details about telling one of them that she wasn't submissive enough. Like, God, that's just, it is pathetic how common that is as a turn of phrase that people will use to try and coerce someone into doing things that aren't within their limits, or doing things that they don't have a desire to do, because, well, but if you really want to be my submissive, you should just do this. Like, no, Neil, you're not a master, you're not a dom, you're an abuser. And you may wear that title, you may call yourself that in the bedroom, I can't stop you, but you are not following the underlying tenets of BDSM in any way, shape, or form. I suspect you may know that, even if you haven't really internalized it for yourself yet. And it feels weird to call Neil Gaiman a fake dom. I wish we had a better term than that. And I think the only thing we can really call him at this point is seemingly an abuser. This was a really hard video to make. I was very, not that it's a competition or anything of obviously the experiences themselves are more difficult than me talking about it in a YouTube video. But there's something about this that felt like I almost was scared to look at it. I knew about the allegations, but I didn't know what I would find when I turned that stone over. And unfortunately, it was worse than I expected. I've covered the allegations against Marilyn Manson, against Armie Hammer, House of Cataphor, and the details in this one are uniquely terrible in so many ways. And the sexual coercion is a big problem, and maybe I need to make a dedicated video where I talk about recognizing sexual coercion especially in a BDSM context, because I don't think people know about it in a vanilla one, let alone a kink one. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. If you want to make sure to not miss out on that part 2, as well as additional coverage I'm going to be doing about House of Cataphor and Marilyn Manson and Armie Hammer, go ahead and subscribe. I'm going to be covering a lot of those cases in the next month or so. Just they all happen to kind of be updating around the same time, for better or for worse. So yeah, you can subscribe for that. And I do general education about kink and BDSM. So if you want to have resources to be able to stay safe, maybe be better at recognizing abuse, and know how to do BDSM in a more ethical way, you can subscribe for that. And if you want to support what I do, you can go over to Patreon. This video will almost assuredly be demonetized. I'm not even going to attempt to monetize it because making money off of this kind of feels gross. But if you want to support what I do so I can spend 12 hours writing a 10-page script about Neil Gaiman's allegations, you can go to my Patreon. You can support me over there. And thank you all so much for watching. Stay safe. Go watch a fun video. Decompress. Have a little snack. Take care of yourselves. I will talk to you all again very soon. Again, thank you so much. If you do already support me, if you do subscribe, thank you again. And I will talk to you all again very soon. Bye.